Hello, and thanks for joining us on another edition of Canada Files. I'm Jim Deeks, and our guest on this episode is Kirsten Hillman, Canada's ambassador to the United States. Born and raised in Western Canada, Ms. Hillman practiced law after graduating from McGill University in Montreal, then embarked on a very successful career as a federal bureaucrat, specializing in trade negotiations, including the pivotal U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement completed in 2019. She was appointed ambassador to Washington in March 2020. Ambassador Hillman, thanks so much for joining us on Canada Files.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Jim.
You know, as you well know, you are the first woman to hold the job of Canadian ambassador to the United States, and I would think you're one of the youngest in history. You know, one generally thinks of perhaps a seasoned career diplomat or sometimes a political friend of the Prime Minister's being awarded the job. But you have managed to buck both of those trends. Tell us briefly how you got the job.
Oh, thanks. And thank you for calling me young. I appreciate that. You're right. I don't have a traditional diplomatic career. I have spent most of my career as a trade negotiator and trade lawyer within the Government of Canada. I came into the government at the time that the WTO and the NAFTA were just created, and represented Canada as a lawyer before the WTO and the NAFTA panels. Quite young, had a lot of responsibility. In those early days, we were all just trying to figure it out because it was quite new, and transitioned from that to trade negotiator. Spent a brief time in Switzerland as the head of our legal office there. And I really started to move into the trade negotiation international space when, under Prime Minister Harper, we were seeking to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which is a negotiation that was happening between the United States, some Latin American countries, and many Asian countries. At the time, they weren't that interested in having Canada join during the course of the negotiations, but it was very important to us. So I was tasked with mounting the campaign to get us into those negotiations. I traveled the world from Brunei to Singapore to Peru, and we succeeded. And after that, Prime Minister Harper named me as chief negotiator for those negotiations. And I also, at the same time, was running the branch of the Canadian government responsible for all trade negotiations. So through all of that, I ended up ultimately here in Washington after President Trump was elected and the NAFTA negotiations were started in order to work on those negotiations here in D.C. It was a complicated and tricky negotiation, to be sure, but ultimately really successful. And it was after that Prime Minister Trudeau asked me if I would serve as Canada's ambassador to the United States, which is truly the honor and privilege of my career.
You know, assuming that the ambassadorship to Washington is the one job that, or the outcome, I guess, that most career diplomats would really wish for, is it fair, in your view, that people who aren't career diplomats, perhaps like yourself, or political appointees, are actually given the job?
I think that the job is a job that requires a few things. It requires a high level of trust and a good relationship between the leader of our country, the Prime Minister, and the incumbent. Ultimately, this job, the role of this job is to represent the Government of Canada in the United States. So you have to be someone who the Prime Minister knows, trusts. You have to be able to pick up the phone and be able to call him or her, in this case him, and talk to them and give clear advice whenever needed. I think that is the most important feature of the job, because here we are dealing with, the relationship, frankly, that is the most important in our country, and we need to be able to have those direct channels of advice and communication.
I guess the old image of a diplomat is one who, as you say, acts as the liaison between governments and leaders. But today, if Joe Biden wants to talk to Justin Trudeau, doesn't he just pick up the phone and call Washington without necessarily having to go through your office?
No. In fact, he does indeed go through our office. I mean, the systems are still in place. We are the liaison of the White House to the Prime Minister and his office. So those communications indeed go through us. And in fact, for the entire cabinet, we serve as advisors to all members of the cabinet on what's happening here. Fundamentally, our responsibility is, I mean, there are many aspects to my job and the job of my team here in Washington and around the country, but we are people who are tasked with helping our government, but all Canadians, provinces, industry, civil society, as necessary, communicate effectively with their U.S. counterparts. So we serve as people who provide context, provide facts from the ground, give advice on really what's preoccupying people here to our government, to the Prime Minister and his cabinet and many others, so that their relationships can be effective here in the United States. And we do the opposite too, right? We talk to Americans, whether it's the White House and the administration, state level representatives, Congress, business people, about the priorities and about the interests of Canada, so that when they engage with their Canadian counterparts, those conversations are effective.
If the president is talking to the Prime Minister on the phone, are you and some of your colleagues in the embassy and conversely advisors to the president also are they also on these calls and or listening in and advising both leaders on ask this, or he just said that, be careful, or is it literally just a mano conversation?
Well, now you're asking for some of our trade secrets that we have to keep a little bit of mystery to the job. But let's just say that we are very we keep very good track of the conversations that happen at the political level, at all levels. And there's different kinds of conversations. Some are more public and some are more private. It really depends on the issues that we're talking about.
How diplomatic does an ambassador have to be? And I know that sounds like a dumb question, but I would imagine there would be issues that you have a personal interest in, not necessarily individually, but just your own opinions, whether it's in the current case, perhaps the building of the Keystone Pipeline between our two countries, or the ongoing softwood lumber dispute between Canada and the U.S. If you have your own personal opinions, are you allowed to express them, even if they may be slightly opposite to the official government position?
My job and the job of all of our team here is to, when we are representing the government of Canada, is to represent the policies of the government of Canada. That is absolutely our job. I'm a citizen of Canada. I have views. I express those views in my personal life, but my job is to represent the government here. But around being diplomatic, I think that one thing I would say about that is, as we've talked about, I'm not a career diplomat. I'm not a traditional diplomat, and what that has meant, what that means for me, is that I engage as myself. I'm very much, who I am. And I'm a very direct person. I'm a very straightforward person. I'm Canadian, so I'm very polite and respectful, but I'm quite firm and I'm quite direct. And I think that makes me maybe somewhat unorthodox as an ambassador, but it also makes me very effective here in the United States, because the Americans like straight talk. And there are many of them who have said to me, many of my counterparts have said to me how refreshing and how much they appreciate my ability just to really be very honest and frank about what it is that's on our minds. I think that's the best way for our relationship here with the Americans to move forward.
You took over as ambassador a little over a year ago, succeeding David McNaughton, who was a political appointment. I know David McNaughton, and I know him to be a very bright, careful, and diplomatic person, but I wonder whether In the context of having to be an ambassador during the presidency of Donald Trump, whether a seasoned career diplomat might have been more effective, perhaps, in being able to counter President Trump's whims, and particularly the tariffs that he introduced on steel and aluminum that took everyone by surprise.
Well, from where I sit, I think that our government was exceedingly successful with the Trump administration. We had a situation where we had an existential, essentially, economic threat to our country when the NAFTA was under renegotiation, and the president was, I think, quite willing to walk away from that agreement altogether. Those were difficult negotiations. Everybody saw that they were difficult negotiations. The imposition of the steel and aluminum tariffs that you mentioned were added to that complexity and added to those challenges. They were imposed, on the pretext of national security reasons, which was very challenging for Canada and for Canadians. But ultimately, in those negotiations and in all of our interactions with the previous administration, but frankly any administration, the Canadian approach is to be strong and to stand up for the Canadian interest, to stand up for Canadian businesses, to stand up for Canadian workers. So it was often said in the negotiations, we're not going to escalate matters, but we're not going to back down. And that's exactly what we did. It was a very effective approach with President Trump, and it's a very effective approach, with our neighbor here overall. We are very privileged to have the United States as a neighbor, and we gain an enormous advantage from being their closest neighbor and ally and friend. But sometimes decisions they make are challenging for Canada. And when that happens, we have to stand up, we have to be firm, polite, but firm. And I think we did that very well under the previous administration and in administrations before that.
But how difficult a process was it for you all, and by y'all, I mean you and External Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland, who was our chief negotiator on the NAFTA talks, and the Prime Minister himself. How difficult a process was it to go through knowing that you were dealing with a mercurial force, let's put it that way, at the other end of the talks?
It was a complicated and challenging negotiation. It was that is true, and all Canadians saw that. But there were many factors to that negotiation, and there are many factors in the U.S. political system. So there is the president and his approach, but there's also Congress, and there's also very, powerful allies that we have in the Senate and the House. And here in the United States, no trade agreement can come into force without passing through Congress. So we spend a lot of time making sure that our allies in Congress and our allies in the business community and our allies in the labor community all were also expressing their views as to how these negotiations should turn out. And really what we were looking for, and what we ultimately achieved, I think, very, very well, is a negotiation that moves the relationship forward, that modernizes it, that's good for Canadian workers, that's good for Canada, that brings that agreement that was over 20 years old, right, into the modern times so that it's effective for businesses. So yes, there was the discussions with the White House and the President, of course, and those, as I say, I think were very effectively managed because we were strong and we were firm. But also, we had many, many other relationships that contributed to our success.
Ultimately, was it a good thing that NAFTA was renegotiated? As you mentioned, there were some things that were perhaps a little out of date.
Absolutely. So 20 years ago, or over 20 years ago, when the NAFTA entered into force, there was no internet, right? Our businesses, the way they do business today, has changed radically from the way it was done back in the day. There were no provisions in the original NAFTA on e-commerce and digital trade, which made it very much in need of updating. So we did all of those things. And in addition, we took account of other aspects of the trading international regime that are very important for Canadians right now. And were less on the radar screen 20 some years ago, including binding provisions around labor rights and labor protections, and of course strong environmental provisions that are fully enforceable in the treaty. So in many, many ways we brought it up to date, and it is a much it's a much stronger agreement because of it.
David Frum, a political commentator in Washington whom you would well know, was our first guest on Canada Files this season, and we asked him whether Canada-U.S. relations had been irrevocably altered or damaged by the presidency of Donald Trump. And he said, no, the bilateral relation will certainly heal very quickly, but that Trump's actions throughout the world may have been so negative that North America as a whole may have been negatively affected by Trump. From a diplomat's perspective, do you agree with that assessment?
You know, I have a great respect for David Frum and enjoy his company very much, but I don't agree with that. In fact, from where I sat during the Trump administration, one thing that happened and that we saw regularly was other countries reaching out to us, our allies from the G7, from Asia, from around the world, reaching out to us for advice and guidance as to how to approach the Trump administration and how to get things done with the Trump administration. There's no doubt that we had challenges in the relationship over those 4 years, but ultimately we managed to solve problems and get things done with President Trump and his administration. And many countries took note of that and really looked to us for advice and guidance on how to do the same.
What are some of the bilateral issues that you're going to be working on over the next couple of years with the Biden administration?
About a little over a month ago now, the President and the Prime Minister issued a roadmap for the Canada-U.S. relationship. And it is a roadmap that is looking forward in time over the next few years. For anyone interested in Canada-U.S. relations, I commend you that document. It is an incredibly substantive piece of a vision for our two countries. There are dozens of very concrete things that are identified as things that we're going to do together in fighting COVID, in economic recovery, in fighting climate change, with respect to our energy relationship, international cooperation, security and defense, fighting for racial equity. I mean, it is incredible. It is the most comprehensive leader's statement that I have seen in my career. And I think it's remarkable. And I think that it's remarkable for a couple of reasons. One, because it demonstrates the degree of alignment between our government and the U.S. administration, which is a very good thing for Canada. Doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything. We of course won't, but there is an enormous amount of alignment between our two governments. But secondly, it also demonstrates the moment that we're in. Right? We are in a moment where we've come through and are coming through a very, very difficult time in our national history, in our bilateral history, with COVID, with the economic decline, and globally. And it shows that there are two leaders who have very similar visions as to how to bring the world out of this time. It's a very good time for Canada-U.S. relations.
As you well know, there are two Canadian businessmen who are sitting in jail in China, and they've been there in jail for over 2 years. Most Canadians believe that this situation is totally in retaliation to the fact that Canada is holding under effective house arrest a Chinese businesswoman in Vancouver who is awaiting extradition to the United States for a trial on conspiracy and fraud charges. Most Canadians believe that this is just totally unfair and that we and those two unfortunate businessmen are totally caught in the middle on this thing. What has your role as Canadian ambassador to Washington been in this situation, which seems to be going nowhere?
So first of all, I'd like to say that the arbitrary detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor is and securing their release is a core priority for our government. But it is also something that's a core priority for many of our allies around the world who are expressing their outrage and condemnation of this kind of hostage diplomacy. As you say, these two gentlemen have been in jail for over 2 years because Canada abided by and is continuing to abide by our international commitments to the United States under our extradition treaty. We are following the rule of law, and we are respecting those obligations. As a consequence, these two men have been arbitrarily detained. So our partners around the world are working with us to express condemnation, and at the forefront of those partnerships are our American friends. From the president on down, we have had the strongest expressions of support. There isn't a single conversation that I have with the White House or senior member of the administration, or in fact, many of our contacts in Congress and even in the private sector here, where there isn't an offer to do whatever people can to help us with this situation. And in this administration, the Biden administration and Vice President Tariffs as well, have said that they are approaching efforts to secure the release of those men as though they were American citizens. And that's a very powerful thing. So to your question, it is something that is on my desk every single day. It is something that I talk to the leadership here about every single day. And I have the utmost confidence that they are, doing everything they can to work with us to secure the early release of these men.
Will diplomacy ultimately resolve this issue, or will it take perhaps a darker turn?
I am a believer in diplomacy. I'm a believer in talking things through. It's uncautionable that they have been in these conditions for over 2 years. So we will work every angle to get them home.
Do women make better diplomats than men?
Well, being only a woman, it's hard for me to assess that. I think that the skills of diplomacy come down to personal characteristics that are, probably found in women and men. It's a job where you need to be a very good listener. You need to be very attuned to the perspectives of your interlocutor. You need to be very strategic, and you need to know how to communicate. And sometimes that means not saying much, and sometimes that means saying a lot. So I suspect, both men and women possess those traits.
For all the advances that women have made in all walks of life in the last 25 years or longer, I think you would still agree that there is still a glass ceiling, that there's still disparity in salaries between men and women, and there are still age-old attitudes about women, perhaps women in business more than any other profession. Assuming that there is some degree of a built-in obsolescence to a posting like ambassador to Washington, what is next for you on the career path? Do you retire and join a lot of corporate boards and make a lot of money? Do you go back to Ottawa and resume a career as a leading bureaucrat? Do you run for politics one day yourself? What do you see as the next steps?
Well, those are all very interesting ideas, Jim. I guess what I would say is that I've only been here a little over a year. I love this job. I don't really want to go anywhere right now. I think I'm in the right place for me right now. I think that, what the future holds, we'll see. There's a lot of exciting things to do out there in the world, but for now, I'm really focused on being here.
All right, I'm going to ask one final question, which I ask all our guests on Canada Files, and I'm always amazed at the variety of answers I get to this single question. And in your case, it's a particularly important question because, in a very real sense, you are representing the concept of being Canadian for our country to our most important neighbor and trading partner. And the question is, what does being Canadian mean to you personally?
That's a great question. I think Canada is the greatest country in the world. And every single day, I'm reminded of how proud I am to be Canadian and how privileged I am to be representing our country here or anywhere. We are young, we're vibrant, we're diverse, we're energetic, we're creative, we're just an open, vibrant society. But we're also a society that cares, right? We care about our communities at home, we care about our communities abroad, we care about standing up for our values, democracy, human rights, rule of law, and we're consistent in the deeds that we do and the acts that we take. And I am very proud of that. And it doesn't mean that we get everything right. And it doesn't mean that we still don't have challenges. We still have a lot of work to do at home, with respect to our Indigenous communities, with respect to racial equity, with respect to making sure that diversity and inclusivity is a feature of all Canadian society. We're trying, but we're certainly not where we need to be. And so I think that for me, being Canadian means being proud of all of these wonderful things that we bring to the table, which are remarkable, and being confident about all of those things that we bring to the table, while at the same time realizing, we still have work to do, and owning that. I couldn't think of a better country to be from, with all due respect to our dear American friends.
Well, Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for that. Thank you for representing our country with the skill and aplomb that you do. And thanks for sharing your thoughts with us on Canada Files.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us on Canada Files. We hope you'll do so next time.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, as well as the following donors: the Browning Watt Foundation, Nona MacDonald Heaslip, Joe and Marie Heffernan, Michael and Mary Ellen Hogan, Donna and Richard Ivey, Alice and Ted Kernahan, Richard and Gail McGraw, the North Pine Foundation, Eleanor and Francis Shen, the 63 Foundation, John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, in memory of Peter A. Deeks, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.